Investigators in Canada are on the trail of a killer. The key lies in the victim's cells. But has fire destroyed all the evidence? At a murder scene, a handful of cigarettes provides the only clue. Will forensic detectives be able to unlock their secret? This young man was imprisoned for a rape he swears he didn't commit. Can science prove he's innocent? When police are stumped, they may turn to detectives in lab coats to uncover clues hidden inside the human cell. One strand of DNA can finger a killer or set the innocent free. The new shape of crime detection is a double helix. In July 1991, a janitor in Vancouver, British Columbia made a routine trip to the dumpster. But what he found was far from routine. Inside lay a body burned so completely he wasn't sure it was human. He ran to call police. Across town, detectives Al Catley and Rick Crook responded to the call. The homicide investigators had done this drill before. What may look like a human body sometimes turns out to be a practical joke, a discarded mannequin, or some other case of mistaken identity. They hoped that was all it was. Still, they had to check it out.
So when we walked over to take a look at inside the dumpster, there was just the outline of a human body. And in fact, it was so badly destroyed by the fire that it was questionable as to whether it was human, or we've had some instances of bear carcasses being destroyed after illegal hunting or something like that. And we didn't rule out that possibility.
You can't.
No.
The thing is, though,
The officers approached the dumpster carefully, making note of details that could become important later. The dumpster was cool to the touch when they arrived. The fire had been out for hours. A stain spread from the corner onto the pavement. Whoever set the blaze used more than enough flammable liquid to destroy the contents. A close inspection of the contents confirmed that this was no false alarm. There, amid the ashes of computer boxes, wooden flats, and scrap paper, lay a human body. After the detectives made their notes, the delicate removal of the fragile evidence began. It was gently placed in a body bag so as not to damage it any further. Then it went to the morgue, where a pathologist would examine the body for clues to its identity. Anything else that survived the blaze was also collected and sealed.
not surprising. No.
Surveying the scene, the detectives realized the murderer selected his site carefully. An industrial park closed for the weekend, surrounded by brush and trees.
In fact, we did establish that people were driving by roughly the time that we think that the homicide occurred, or the burning occurred, and there wasn't anything. You could have quite easily have driven up here and probably out without really seeing what you would have thought was a fire.
Homicides are often solved in the first 24 hours when investigators follow hot leads. But in this case, the fire had gone out. The trail had grown cold. If the murder happened just 5 years earlier, Crook and Catley would have relied solely on hunches and their talent for bulldogging a case until they had the answers. But by 1991, when this victim died, Crook and Catley knew they had an ally in the lab. A powerful new tool had been added to crime solving: DNA profiling. investigators no longer needed a shred of evidence to solve a case. They only needed a single cell. As personal as the whorls and lines of a fingerprint, but far more difficult to hide, DNA is the next wave in scientific sleuthing. Today, scientists can extract DNA on a sweat-stained hat left by a nervous killer, from saliva on the stamp of an extortionist's letter, or from dried blood or skin scraped from underneath a victim's fingernails. Microscopic evidence has always been left behind by criminals. Only with the advent of DNA profiling has it become incriminating. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, contains every detail that makes you human.
Back to where it was.
No two people, except identical twins, share the same patterns. DNA is small enough to fit inside the nucleus of every cell. Its shape is a double helix, like a spiral staircase wrapped around a column. Uncoiled, the double helix would stretch to 8 feet. About 99.5% of everyone's DNA is the same, but some sections vary greatly from person to person. By studying those sections, scientists can identify victims and unmask murderers. In the Virginia Division of Forensic Science in Richmond, Paul Ferrara runs one of the most progressive DNA testing labs in the country.
With the sensitivity of this technology, I don't know that I could go in and commit a violent crime and just not somehow leave something of me behind. And that's all it takes with this technology, just some little piece of me that's got a cell with a nucleus in it, and I'm in deep trouble.
Heat is the enemy of DNA, and fire is the bane of forensic investigators who try to recover DNA from torched crime scenes. A week after the victim was found, Crook and firefighters recreated the inferno to see if it could shed some light on the crime. Whether by design or accident, the killer left one lid open, creating a downdraft inside the dumpster. The rushing air whipped the flames into a frenzy. The surrounding trees hid what little smoke the fire produced. It burned at about 2,000 degrees for 30 to 40 minutes. By comparison, a crematorium burns between 1,000 to 1,400 degrees for about 3 hours. Police were lucky to have any remains at all. Now they had to figure out who was killed here. All the pathologist could tell them was that the victim was a white female. Traditional methods at a standstill. Detectives focused on X-rays. They showed the victim was shot in the head, but they also revealed a feature detectives hoped would identify her. David Sweet, a forensic odontologist or dental investigator, worked on the case. Teeth are the hardest substance in the human body and the most difficult to destroy. When bodies can't be easily identified, odontologists look to the teeth to tell them about the victim. Their wear and condition can hold the story of a person's life, whether they were right or left-handed, drank water with fluoride as a child, or wore braces. By studying the victim's teeth, it was determined that she was in her early 20s. She had one extraordinary feature.
But the other thing that we realized when we examined the teeth was there was an extra tooth right in the center of the upper jaw between the upper central incisors. And those showed up very well in the x-rays that were taken after the victim died.
Crook ran a computer search that compared his findings with dental records of missing persons. None matched. Despite his best efforts, Crook was stymied. He still had a victim without a name and a murder without a suspect. Meanwhile, somewhere out there, a killer ran free, confident nothing could link him to his crime. What he didn't know was that a small piece of evidence could provide the missing link.
That looks great.
Oh, he cheated.
For 2 days, Detective Al Catley chased a ghost.
Good, good. And yourself?
Who was the woman in the
Karen, I'll tell you
dumpster?
what we had.
What awful chain of events led to her murder? Surely by now someone, a friend, a lover, a co-worker, was missing her. Catley asked his staff for missing persons reports. One stood out. Lynn Breeden, age 30. Her roommate filed the report. He had dropped her off at a friend's house. The friend saw her leaving a nightclub around 3 a.m. the night before the burned woman was found. She left with an unknown man. 3 days later, a woman posing as Lynn Breeden tried to empty her bank account. The woman presented a withdrawal slip with Breeden's account number.
Hi, I need to make a withdrawal.
Okay.
The teller knew she wasn't who she claimed to be. When she questioned the imposter,
And
the
she's
woman
been out of
became
town.
flustered.
She asked me just to withdraw some money so I could pay some bills for her. Like the ID.
When the teller tried to detain the woman, she hurried out.
No, I need you
go.
to stay here.
Wait, I gotta go.
No, I need you to stay here.
A security camera captured the failed transaction. Analysis of the film revealed a man waiting for the woman in the parking lot. Police made a photo of the woman from the tape and ran it in the newspaper. She was identified and called in for questioning. She told police a friend had offered her $500 to scam the bank. She knew nothing of the murder. The friend was Chris Cruz, an exotic dancer who used the stage name Tony Devons. Detectives placed him under constant surveillance, then asked him to come in to speak with police.
Homicide squad.
Not realizing police were watching him, Cruz parked his car 2 blocks from the station and walked the rest of the way.
Serious criminal matter.
The surveillance officers called Sergeant Crook to tell him they thought Cruz must be hiding something in his car.
In the 400 block Main Street.
When Cruz arrived at the station, police asked if they could search his car. He told them the car was at his parents' in another county.
You do have the keys and I want them.
They knew he was lying. They told him they knew where he parked it, and they didn't need his permission to search it. Reluctantly, he handed over the keys. Forensic investigators took pictures of the car from every angle, carefully recording what they saw before touching it. They moved in closer to gather more evidence, collecting and photographing virtually everything. It was too soon to tell what might be important later. The men worked in teams. Some officers inspected the evidence, while others marked where it was found. Investigators found bloodstains on the sides and rear of the car. They marked the positions carefully. Later, the shape of the stains would be analyzed to calculate what direction the blood came from and its point of origin. These details are crucial for reconstructing a crime. Blood samples may also be collected for DNA analysis. Police searched the car inside and out. They looked through personal items in the back seat, hoping to find any piece of evidence to tie the victim to the car.
All right, it's 10:05. We're going into the trunk.
Next, they opened the trunk.
Oh, look at this right off the bat.
Inside, they found a gas can and other objects covered with blood.
Get a shot. One moment.
Beneath some clothing, they found several key pieces of evidence: a bloody tire iron and a .22 caliber rifle.
I'd say that's the
The
deal.
detectives now were almost certain Cruz killed Lynn Breeden, but they had no way of connecting the suspect to the victim. Cruz denied knowing her. He told friends he bought her identification on the black market, and police couldn't prove the blood on the car was hers. They needed to compare the DNA from the blood on the car to DNA from the victim. But where could they find the victim's DNA? They turned to David Sweet for help. He suggested looking for it in her impacted wisdom teeth. No one had ever tried it before, but it was their last hope.
We know theoretically that there are cells still embedded in the mineral tissues of the teeth, and we should be able to open the teeth, extract those cellular materials, and extract the DNA from the cells, and then process it in a forensic DNA analysis.
A tooth is an armor coating that surrounds a core of living tissue. Sweet hoped the tissue within the impacted wisdom teeth were protected from the fire by the thick jawbones surrounding them. He cut the first wisdom tooth from crown to root, but found no tissue inside. His second attempt was more successful. He found tissue, but he didn't know if its DNA was destroyed by the fire. He sent it to the lab to be tested. All he could do was wait.
Okay.
Did Chris Cruz kill Lynn Breeden? The answer was in a forensic lab in Vancouver, where the victim's tissue was sent for testing. Finally, Dr. Sweet received the results. The DNA survived the fire. What's more, further testing showed the DNA from the victim matched the DNA from the blood in Cruz's car. The lab calculated the odds that it wasn't the victim's blood were 1 in 540 million. Dr. Sweet proved that Lynn Breeden was in the car the night she died. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Chris Cruz confessed to murder. Based on interviews, detectives pieced together a likely scenario of that fatal night. Breeden once borrowed a great deal of money from Cruz. Now he wanted to collect. Breeden refused to pay him. Cruz lost his temper. Growing impatient, she got out of his car. Cruz beat her, shoved her body in the trunk, and drove to the dumpster. After he arrived at the secluded spot, the victim began to regain consciousness. Chris Cruz shot her. He thought the flames would erase all the evidence. How could he know the charge of murder would come from his victim's own mouth? Found guilty of second-degree murder, Chris Cruz received a life sentence. In rural Clay County, Alabama, a drive along Route 31 leads to a town caught between memories and progress, where turn-of-the-century storefronts share billing with a new city hall, where folks still get their news word of mouth, and where bad news and good news travel at about the same speed. Summertime slow. It's a safe place where parents don't think twice about giving their teenagers free rein to explore the land. A place where violence is an unwelcome stranger. On July 22nd, 1995, 3 riders on all-terrain vehicles discovered a burned mattress in the woods, and beneath it, what appeared to be blackened bones. They contacted Sheriff Ralph Toland, who responded to the call.
You think you've got a body? 3 miles. 3 miles east of 4977 intersection. Okay, we'll be on our way.
The men met the sheriff and led him to their grim discovery. It looked like murder. Toland began to secure the crime scene, but knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to be sure no evidence was jeopardized.
I got down into the scene and I saw exactly what had happened. Saw the mattress charred and burned, nothing left but the springs over a skeleton. I just stopped everybody where they were at and told them to stop right there. Had them to go back out to the entrance from the road and asked them all just to secure it. I wanted forensic and the criminalist to come and help us collect all the evidence.
The man he wanted was Angelo Dellamana. A scientist with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, Dellamana never knows what he's going to find when he answers a call.
Whenever you get to a crime scene, you hope that it's been secure and cordoned off right after the discovery of the body. You don't want anybody into the crime scene that doesn't belong there. You don't want anybody messing up evidence. You want the evidence to be maintained in a secure fashion so that when you as a scientist get there to recover it, you can collect it without disturbing it, preserve it, bring it back to the laboratory, and do the tests that you need on it to find out who did the crime.
Dellamana marked the position of the body, the condition of the mattress and the surrounding area before he went to work collecting everything he could. Dellamana placed flags to mark the position of what little evidence he found. He marked 11 used cigarettes randomly scattered around the mattress. They hadn't been there long. That was a good sign. But who smoked them? The killer? The victim?
I felt it was going to be very hard not only to identify that person, but to generate some kind of evidence. I did feel at the crime scene that the cigarette butts present there were going to be very strong evidence because they did not look weathered. They were sitting up on top of the cushion of grass. I felt they had not been there very long.
As Dellamana assessed the situation, his technicians recorded the evidence. Since technicians don't want to leave part of themselves behind, they wear gloves. Dellamana's people had been trained so they don't unwittingly destroy the very clues that they're trying to save. If forensic scientists are careless in how they collect, store, or process evidence, they'll leave themselves vulnerable to attack in the courtroom. After the evidence was marked, photographed, and recorded, technicians carefully collected it. Bodies don't just turn up without someone missing them. Sheriff Toland already had a sinking suspicion about who the victim was. The week before, Jimmy Paris called him to report that his wife, Peggy Laughlin, was missing. Sheriff Toland decided it was time for his deputies to pay Paris a call.
You can't think of anywhere else she might have gone?
It was no secret around town that the couple had more than their share of knockdown, drag-out fights. No one would be surprised if Peggy just decided to up and leave. Meanwhile, the medical examiner compared the victim's backbone to spinal x-rays of Peggy Laughlin. They matched. Jimmy Paris became the prime suspect. But where was the evidence? Paris denied being anywhere near the woods that night. Delamanna tried to put the pieces together, but he didn't have enough of them to complete the picture. The forensics team turned up nothing at the crime scene. The cigarettes were the only clue untouched by the fire. The answer must lie with them. Detectives told him both Peggy and Jimmy smoked.
You can be looking at a case and feel going in that there isn't very much evidence there. The investigators don't think there's very much there to work with. But when you, as a forensic scientist, find that small piece of evidence, that one link that can either nail the suspect or clear a falsely accused individual, the rush that comes from that makes all the long hours worthwhile.
If he could lift DNA from the cigarette filters, he could compare it to the DNA of Paris and Laughlin. If he could prove they were together in the woods, Toland could make a case against Paris. Delamanna shined an ultraviolet light on the cigarettes. The light revealed the saliva-soaked areas. DNA can be obtained from saliva and lip cells. He marked the outline of the glowing portion he wanted to test. Then he carefully trimmed it away and sent it to the lab for DNA profiling.
To build a DNA profile, what we do first is we take our evidence sample, blood or saliva or whatever the DNA is in. Okay, what we do is we break open the cell and release the DNA. So we extract the DNA from whatever it's on. We clean it up and we look at specific areas or addresses on the DNA, and we make millions of copies of that area big enough so that we can see it. Once the DNA profile is done for each person in the case, we can then compare it to the evidence DNA profile and see if there's any matches there at all.
He was encouraged by the results. The lab identified DNA from 2 people, and 2 of the cigarettes held DNA from both people, meaning they shared their smokes. Could Delamanna prove those 2 people were Jimmy Paris and Peggy Laughlin? Testing Paris's DNA was simple. Cooperating with police, he gave a blood sample, which provided ample DNA to analyze. But getting Laughlin's DNA proved much more difficult. Delamanna had to try extracting it from her remains. He felt the best place to look for the DNA was in the marrow of the femur, or thigh bone. The largest bone in the body, it's the one most likely to have protected DNA from the fire. Bone marrow is rich in DNA. To expose as many cells as possible, Delamanna ground it into a powder. He gave the powder to another scientist for DNA extraction. The scientist places the powder into a chemical bath that breaks open the cell's nuclei, releasing the DNA. Once the DNA is in the solution, bone fragments, chemicals, and impurities must be removed. The liquid goes through a series of microscopic filters. A centrifuge spins away the refuse. The filters trap the clean DNA. Theoretically, scientists can obtain DNA from just one cell. But to create a profile, they generally need thousands, though that number is decreasing. Not long ago, tests required a sample the size of a dime. Today, they can extract usable DNA from a drop of blood the size of a pinhead. The DNA is isolated. Now it's time to measure it. When the DNA is drawn through a membrane, it creates a band of color. By comparing the color, scientists can determine how much DNA they have. Delamana examines the results, which appear as small dark bands on a piece of film. DNA is measured in minuscule quantities called nanograms, or billionths of a gram. The test results tell Delamana whether he has enough DNA to work with.
Unfortunately, there's only about 0.3 nanograms of DNA in that sample. That's point and then 9 zeros and a 3 grams of DNA in that sample.
Delamana didn't have enough usable DNA for testing, but he had an ace up his sleeve, a scientific process so revolutionary, its inventor, Carrie B. Mullis, won the Nobel Prize. Up until 1993, scientists could test DNA only if they had large quantities. But bacteria, heat, and time take their toll, degrading DNA and leaving it in fragments. A process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, enables scientists to make multiple copies of DNA. DNA is made up of 4 chemical units: adenine, A, thymine, T, guanine, G, and cytosine, C. These units are strung together like beads. A joins only with T, and G joins only with C. PCR works by splitting apart the double-stranded DNA like a zipper. The thermocycler heats the DNA, separating the A from the T and the G from the C, essentially unzipping the helix down the center. More of these chemicals are added to the solution, and the 2 halves of the helix use them to make themselves whole. Repeat the process, and the 2 become 4, and so on until millions of copies are created and the sample can be measured. When making a DNA profile, scientists don't need to compare the entire DNA molecule. They only look at several sites along the helix. If these sites are the same on both samples, the DNA most likely came from the same person. It's considered a match. Scientists used PCR to create enough DNA from the bone to do a profile. But the quantity and quality of the DNA was poor, so they could measure only 1 site. But in order to make a match, they needed to identify at least 2 sites. How could they find that second site? Delamana knew that a child's DNA is a combination of both parents' DNA. To solve Peggy Laughlin's murder, Delamana needed help from her brothers and sisters. If he could do their profiles, then he could work backward and calculate Peggy's.
Once we knew we didn't have enough DNA to build Peggy's complete DNA profile, we had to go and get a blood sample from every one of her brothers and sisters that were in the United States. These samples came from all over the United States.
As Delamana's investigation continued, Sheriff Toland received a call about an abandoned van found in a neighboring town. A license check showed it belonged to Jimmy Paris. Inside, forensic scientists found blood on the ceiling and walls. Part of the carpeting had been torn out.
I tell you what, Dan, right. Above your head, right above your head.
Whoa, yeah.
You got 3.
I see it.
Based on this evidence, they obtained a search warrant for Paris's home.
Hey, Jimmy. Hey. Sorry to bother you. You let us in to help us just fine. Stand aside there, back off with the gun. Found it.
Deputies searched the house for any clues that could link Paris to his wife's death. But they found nothing. Then an officer checked the crawl space and found a section of blood-soaked carpet. It matched the missing piece from Paris's van like a jigsaw puzzle. The possession of the carpet linked Paris to the bloodied van. Police had the murder scene, they had the victim, and they had their suspect. The evidence was strong enough to arrest Jimmy Paris for the murder of his wife. But to strengthen their case for conviction, police needed to link Paris, the van, and the burned mattress together. To do that, Paris had to be placed with the victim just before her death. Angelo Dell'Amana was hard at work trying to accomplish just that. He was ready to make Peggy's DNA profile using the blood samples from her siblings.
We extracted them, put them through our full battery of DNA tests, and what we did was when we got the DNA profiles of the brothers and the sisters, we were able to work backwards and build the rest of Peggy's profile.
The genetic information Dell'Amana gathered from the siblings enabled him to complete the missing link on Peggy's DNA. Peggy's DNA matched the DNA on the cigarettes. Here was proof that Peggy was alive with Jimmy in the woods the night she died. For forensics expert Paul Ferrara, the DNA match was the kind of evidence that tipped the scales against Jimmy Paris.
When looking at DNA evidence and the weight that you put on that DNA evidence, take that and place it in perspective with other evidence of motive, means, and opportunity. And when you combine all of those together, then one can come to an informed opinion that a person is guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
Paris had the motive, means, and opportunity to kill Peggy Laughlin. He was a jealous man, and he'd begun to suspect Peggy of infidelity. On that night, he invited her into the woods. He brought along a mattress, placing it on the ground and covering it with a blanket. Peggy and Jimmy smoked and talked, casually tossing aside the spent cigarettes. There, in the saliva and lip cells, lay the code of the murderer's identity, waiting to reveal its secret. Then, something happened that triggered a rage that drove Jimmy Paris to homicide.
The baby is crying too.
You just leave the baby.
No, I'm gonna go with the baby. You hear me?
Paris knew he had to destroy the body if he wanted to escape detection. Probably thought that if police couldn't find a body, they couldn't link him to the crime. He couldn't see that the evidence he had already left would be enough to convict him.
DNA analysis was crucial in the sense that it placed both the suspect and victim at the scene together. And in that case, having those small pieces of evidence allowed us to put a guilty man in prison and allow the family to put closure to a terrible incident.
In Alabama and Vancouver, scientists struggled to find DNA evidence to link a killer to his victim. But the power of DNA is not just its ability to put people behind bars. It also holds the key to setting them free. Attorney Barry Scheck, part of O.J. Simpson's criminal defense team, doesn't believe everyone behind bars is guilty. Using DNA, he's making a strong case. Scheck heads the Innocence Project, a program at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in New York. The program is dedicated to exonerating the innocent through DNA profiling.
Serological Institute.
And
that they had actually responded, we have something but not enough to test.
That's in one case.
Scheck provides the expertise. The students do the legwork, sifting through hundreds of cases, looking for those with the most promise. Once cases are identified, the students investigate whether the evidence still exists. If it does, they see if it can be used for DNA testing.
I don't know. There's nothing in the red well 2 yet.
It became clear to us that DNA had the power to go back into old cases, re-examine it, and exonerate people that had been convicted many years ago, that lots of people felt might be innocent.
The Innocence Project helped exonerate 30 of the 40 people released through DNA since the project began in 1992. Today, startling FBI statistics show that 1/4 to 1/3 of all DNA testing at its lab clears a suspect. No one knows how many innocent people remain in prison across the United States, but the Innocence Project is doing its best to find them.
Now we have all these cases of people who have been convicted who can credibly come forward and say, look, I didn't commit this crime. There was serological evidence that was introduced against me. There was hair evidence that was introduced against me, for example. Please test items in my case. It'll prove me innocent. And that's happening in case after case after case.
What were the circumstances of the identification?
Louise Hochberg is the executive director of the Innocence Project. In 1993, a convict named Troy Webb appealed to her colleagues for help. He trusted DNA to prove he was innocent of rape.
Troy Webb first wrote to us in 1993, and I understand from Troy that the way he got to us was through his cellmate, who apparently was also a client of the Innocence Project.
Webb was arrested in 1988 after a rape victim picked him out of a photo lineup. Eyewitness identification has led to most convictions where defendants were later proved innocent through DNA profiling. Hochberg believed in Webb's innocence, but it would be 3 years before she and her students returned him to his family in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
The principal criteria for us is, number one, can this person make a credible claim of innocence? And number two, the most important, is there biological evidence in the case that we can test, which combined with other factors will be determinative, will prove that this person did not commit the crime for which he or she was convicted.
The Innocence Project had evidence in the case sent to Paul Ferrara's forensic lab in Richmond. There, scientists compared DNA from evidence left at the rape scene to DNA in a blood sample from Troy Webb.
The level of the technology, even 10 years ago, was such that we couldn't eliminate Troy Webb, for example, as the possible contributor of the genetic material. But by the same token, we wouldn't have been able to eliminate a large percent of the population.
Before they could start the testing process, the lab had to retrieve genetic material from evidence stored 7 years earlier. Once it was identified, they had to see if it contained viable DNA. They used an acid test to confirm the biological fluid was present. If the fluid is present, the indicator liquid turns purple. Another method is to use a light source, called an omnichrome, that makes fluids glow. If the scientist is looking for blood to test for DNA, she'll use a chemical called luminol to find it. Luminol can detect the faintest trace of blood, making it especially helpful in instances where blood may have been washed away by rain or where a killer has tried to remove it. In Troy Webb's case, investigators swabbed the evidence from the victim's clothing. The sample would contain the perpetrator's DNA. They'll compare it with Troy's DNA. Comparing DNA is a matter of comparing the lengths of strands of genetic code at specific points on the double helix. Scientists place the DNA sections they want to compare into a gel. The DNA has a negative charge, so scientists can use a positive charge to pull it through the gel. The longer pieces travel more slowly than the shorter pieces, so two pieces of the same length would move the same distance. If the DNA from the evidence and the suspect move the same distance across the gel, scientists know they're the same length and they have a match. If the segments don't move the same distance, they couldn't belong to the same person. The segment lengths can be seen and measured under lights that make the DNA fluoresce. These are the printouts of the actual DNA profiles in the Troy Webb case. They fade with time, so scientists take photographs for a permanent record. Scientists needed to compare only one site on Troy Webb's DNA strand to the DNA from the evidence. If it didn't match, he couldn't have committed the crime.
4.2, 4.3, and the corresponding pattern.
Besides comparing Webb's DNA to the evidence, it's also compared to the DNA of the victim and the rapist. The dot patterns make the differences between the DNA perfectly clear. None of the DNA matches the DNA from the evidence.
This DNA type did not come from Troy Webb, and the true rapist in this case is actually still at large right now.
On September 7th, 1996, the Innocence Project released the results. In Virginia, where new evidence may not be presented more than 21 days after sentencing, the only option was clemency. The governor reviewed the petition and granted the pardon.
There is no greater good that a lawyer can do, in my judgment, than to look back at old cases, and if it can be demonstrated that an injustice was done, to right it.
On October 16, 1996, Troy Webb emerged from prison a free man. The first thing he wanted to do was eat a 7-foot sub from Philadelphia Cold Cuts. He now works at the sub shop. He's made new friends and reestablished a bond with family. He lives with the same faith and hope that kept him going in prison, and he's grateful to the Innocence Project.
They're like family, really, you know, because wasn't for them, I'd probably still be locked up, you know. But they helped me, you know, for free at that, you know. So, couldn't ask for too much more.
All hope is not lost of catching the real rapist. Virginia has amassed the largest database of DNA in the country by collecting blood samples from every convicted felon.
20,000 a year.
Tens of thousands of blood samples pour in every year, creating a backlog of more than 135,000 samples in cold storage. Still, of the nearly 10,000 DNA profiles in the databank, Virginia has already solved 18 crimes by matching DNA from the crime scene. If the DNA from the case can be matched with DNA in the databank, the rapist will be found.
Our DNA data bank here was one of the early ones created. I think we had one hit in 1993, none in 1994, and then 5 in 1995, then 12 in 1996 alone. And the database, even in 1996, only numbered less than 9,000 profiles out of those 130,000 samples we have. When we get to the point where we have the convicted felon profiles, all 130,000 of them, the number of these hits is going to skyrocket dramatically until the point at which they are commonplace. If you are innocent of a crime, DNA technology is your best friend, your best ally. But conversely, if you're guilty, it's your worst enemy.
DNA profiling holds tremendous power for a technology still in its infancy. In its first 10 years, the diminutive double helix has quickly become one of the new detectives' biggest allies, bringing criminals to justice and delivering justice to the innocent. A tourist town becomes a death trap for 3 vacationing women. Investigators must link the suspect to the crime scene, or their case will be dead in the water. During her abduction, a woman is shot on videotape. Can the blurry image help detectives zoom in on her killer? A murder case rests on 2 computer disks that have been cut to ribbons. Now, investigators must invent a way to assemble their evidence bit by bit. Every phone call can be followed. Every transaction leaves a trace. Most of us never give it a second thought. But when a crime occurs, technology becomes an electronic witness. On June 4th, 1989, investigators in Tampa, Florida found themselves plunged into the depths of a mystery. At 9:30 in the morning, boaters discovered a body floating in Tampa Bay. Its hands were tied behind its back. Duct tape covered the nose and mouth. The victim was naked from the waist down. The Coast Guard arrived to recover the body. They cut it free of a weight that dangled below the surface. The victim was female. As they carried her to shore, another call came in. A second body had surfaced 7 miles away. Like the first, she was bound and apparently raped. She was also thrown in alive. It was clearly a victim of the same killer. St. Petersburg detective Sindra Cummings worked the case.
This body, the second one, also had a yellow nylon rope tied around her neck. There was another female nude from the waist down. The end of the rope around her neck was tied to a 2-cell cement block. Her feet were tied together. Her hands were tied at one point, but we believe she struggled and she was able to get her hands free in the water before she died.
The killer hadn't finished. No sooner had the second body been recovered than a third victim surfaced 200 yards away, killed in the same manner. The triple homicide in the water sent out ripples of activity. Police boats scoured Tampa Bay for more victims. Divers descended to the bottom. But no more bodies were found. That was the good news. The bad news was that the killer left no immediate clues. He was still out there, somewhere.
Whoever killed these women had to be some kind of a monster.
The autopsy revealed the 3 women had been dead between 2 and 3 days, giving their killer ample time to flee. Each died from lack of oxygen, either from the tape across their noses and mouths, the rope around their necks, or by drowning. The horror of the crime was compounded by the anonymity of the victims. In a tourist spot like Tampa, people come and go every day. The victims could have come from anywhere. The case was heavily publicized, hoping that someone who knew the victims would come forward. Hundreds of leads poured in. 60 detectives were assigned to follow up. Not one lead panned out. Meanwhile, 1,100 miles away in Van Wert County, Ohio, a dairy farmer named Hal Rogers grew anxious. His wife, Jo, and daughters Michelle and Christy were vacationing in Florida.
But I wish Dad could come. Why can't he?
It was their first time off the farm.
You know someone's got to stay on
The girls had never been to the ocean before and were very excited. But Hal couldn't escape his obligations at the farm and had to send his family without him. Their last postcard was dated 11 days earlier, and they hadn't called in a week. He knew something was wrong. While Hal Rogers contemplated a trip to Florida to look for his family, a maid at a Tampa hotel had suspicions of her own. For 7 days, she returned to the same room to clean it, but found that the occupants hadn't slept in the beds or even opened a bar of soap.
I never saw anybody.
Nobody at all.
The publicity surrounding the murdered women was fresh in her mind. Wondering if there were a connection, she told her manager about the room. He notified the police. The room was registered to Jo Rogers. She had arrived with 2 children. Forensics dusted for fingerprints. One set was positively identified as one of the murder victims. Identification was difficult because the bodies were so decomposed when found. But investigators at last had something to work with. On the hotel registration, Rogers had listed her vehicle. The car wasn't in the parking lot. Tampa police spread out to locate it. They found it parked at a boat ramp 2.5 miles from the hotel. Forensics combed every inch of it for clues. They found a tourist brochure. On the back were handwritten directions to their hotel. The penmanship was compared against Jo's, Christie's, and Michelle's. It didn't match. It was apparently written by someone they met on the road. To investigators, this meant only that they became lost and asked someone for directions. It was hardly a lead. A tourist's life is full of such brief interactions with strangers. That's precisely why investigators were so troubled by this case. The killer, too, was no doubt a stranger to the victims, and crimes committed by strangers are the hardest to solve because nothing connects victim to killer.
It could be anyone from the entire Tampa Bay population that we were concerned about. And it had everyone in Tampa Bay area concerned and worried because the victims were just tourists, someone that everyone can identify with. They weren't in a drug area, they weren't doing anything illegal or anything wrong, and here they were singled out and victimized by an unknown person. And we had no leads to the suspect, nothing to start with.
Investigators also found a sheet of hotel stationery with directions to the boat ramp. They included the words blue with white. Because the directions were to the boat ramp and the women were killed on the water, detectives assumed the words described the killer's boat. It also described hundreds of other boats in Tampa Bay. Investigators determined that the handwriting on the stationery matched Jo Rogers. The killer must have visited or phoned her at the hotel and dictated them. But no one had seen him, and the hotel didn't keep a log of incoming calls. The ferocity of the crime told police that the killer probably had a prior record. More than likely, he worked his way up to murder through a series of smaller crimes. But without further leads, the investigation stagnated. Months rolled by as waves of suspects arose and were eliminated. In October, 4 months after the murders, investigators received a bulletin about a rape that occurred on a boat at Madeira Beach 2 weeks before the Rogers were killed. The victim was a tourist. Madeira Beach was only 10 miles from the murder scene. Sergeant Glenn Moore says the similarities between this case and the Rogers rape and murder didn't stop there.
The suspect in the Madeira Beach case had threatened to use duct tape on the mouth of one of the victim on the Madeira Beach rape case, and that was what was used on our victims. He also threatened this woman with dying. Was it worth dying for? And he also had a blue and white boat.
The victim gave police a description of the rapist.
His eyes were sunken, very sunken.
Besides his blue and white boat, she also remembered that her attacker drove a dark four-wheel drive vehicle with tinted windows. A composite of her attacker's face was published in the papers. Tips flooded in. Months passed as detectives chased every lead that could connect a suspicious stranger to the victims. It came to nothing. By now, almost a year had passed, and all they had was a picture of a rapist who may or may not be the killer. Without any promising leads in the Tampa Bay triple homicide, Sergeant Glenn Moore reviewed the evidence collected so far. He had a composite sketch with no ID and a brochure with directions to the hotel written in a stranger's hand. The brochure was taken to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement lab in Tampa and processed to reveal fingerprints. It held some prints that didn't belong to any of the victims. They were analyzed by latent print examiner Sam McMullen.
There's what we call, or refer to sometimes as writer's palm, and that's when you're writing a document the way that your hand, the palm of your hand, falls on the document itself.
A palm print is just as conclusive as a fingerprint in making an ID. Whoever left these prints wrote the directions on the brochure. Now, detectives wondered if this same person possibly killed the Rogers. If this writer were the killer, his fingerprints were probably on file for prior offenses. Although palm prints become part of a repeat offender's record, they aren't usually cataloged in the computerized fingerprint system. Investigators had no way of doing an automated search. All they could do was manually compare the print against each new suspect that surfaced. More time slipped by without a match. The prints and the writing sample seemed useless. Moore wouldn't let the investigation die. The man who killed the Rogers was at large, and police were determined to find him. To flush him out, they held press conferences, posted billboards.
And typically what happens is you put up a picture of the victims and you say, does anybody know anything about this case? I think what was a little bit different and unique about what we did with the billboards is we actually put a picture of the handwriting evidence up on the billboard and asked people to look at that and tell us if they knew who the handwriter was.
Among the deluge of leads, one stood out. A woman named Joanne Steffi told police that the handwriting looked like a former neighbor's, an aluminum siding contractor named Oba Chandler. She had seen the composite when it first appeared and thought it resembled Chandler. But she wasn't sure. The handwriting rekindled her suspicions.
When we put the handwriting up on the billboards and it brought it back to her attention, she went and checked with some other neighbors and some other people and found some contracts for the business he was in. She made the visual comparison herself along with her neighbors, and they decided it was a great likelihood this was the writer, so they gave us a call.
The contracts and brochure were sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, where they were scrutinized by document examiner Teresa Stubbs.
The examination of handwriting is really a study of movement. You're looking at all the aspects of the writing, the beginning strokes, the ending strokes, the height relationships of letters to other letters. Once I had familiarized myself with all those habits that were on the brochure, then I compared them with the habits found in the known sample of writing submitted as being that of Mr. Chandler. I found that they were significantly similar in all aspects with no differences.
The handwriting match was the break the detectives needed. A little more digging, and investigators found that 45-year-old Oba Chandler had a long criminal record, having been charged with everything from burglary and counterfeiting to kidnapping. Police obtained his palm prints from his prison records. The print found on the brochure matched Oba Chandler's right hand. They had their suspect. Now they had to build their case.
And how are you?
Detectives arranged a photo lineup with the Madeira Beach rape victim, asking if she could identify the man who attacked her.
In these particular photographs.
She selected Oba Chandler's picture. More confident than ever that Chandler was the murderer, Sergeant Moore kept him under surveillance to see if he would tip his hand. He didn't. And they didn't have enough to arrest him. To prove he killed the Rogers, they had to place him at the scene of the crime. The waters of Tampa Bay held no clues. But maybe the answer was in the air. Detectives sought his phone records to see if they could trace his whereabouts. Chandler's phone records showed that on the night of the murders, June 1st, 1989, 5 calls were made between 1:30 and 5 a.m. The prefixes showed that these calls were shipped to shore, made collect to his home.
They were extremely important. They put Oba Chandler on his boat the night of the killings. The night that the women were murdered and thrown into the bay, we could prove that Oba Chandler was on his boat.
At his trial, Chandler said he'd been fishing on the bay that night when his engine failed. He told the jury that his fuel line broke, and by the time he fixed it with duct tape, he'd lost all his gas. He was stranded until a passing boat rescued him the next morning. But the jury didn't buy his fish story. On cross-examination, Chandler couldn't explain why he called home but didn't call a towing service. He couldn't describe where the fuel line enters the engine. He didn't realize that duct tape doesn't stick to a gas-covered fuel line. And most importantly, he didn't know his engine had an anti-siphon valve, making it impossible for the gas to leak out if the line burst.
I believe that was one of the defining moments for the jury, to see him on the stand and to see all of what he said proven wrong.
The prosecution presented a more credible scenario.
Excuse me, sir. Do you know how to get to the Viking Hotel?
Yeah, which one?
Lost in Tampa, Jo Rogers and her daughters stopped to ask directions to their hotel. The friendly stranger who showed them the way was Oba Chandler. Now he knew where they were staying. He may have called them shortly after they checked in, inviting them to watch the setting sun from aboard his boat. Joe jotted down the directions, and off they went. There was no time to unpack. When they arrived at the pier, Chandler was there to greet them. They boarded the boat, never suspecting this was to be their last sunset. For his crimes, Obed Chandler was sentenced to death. Obed Chandler didn't care who he killed. Most murderers are more selective. The road to their conviction begins with a motive. In Northumberland County in central Pennsylvania, a young girl returned home from her grandparents' house. She'd walked this path dozens of times, and her mind was a million miles away. But on June 12, 1989, the foul smell of decay caught her attention. She cautiously investigated, hoping it wasn't a dog struck by a car. What she found was far worse, a human body.
How long ago?
Pennsylvania State Police rushed in to document the scene before the body was transported to the morgue for autopsy. Every homicide investigation begins with 3 questions. Who's the victim? When did the murder take place? And who did it? District Attorney Robert Sakavage, now a district judge, searched for answers.
We could not get a quick identification. We had to use scientific techniques. We had to get a forensic odontologist to examine the teeth and so forth for that purpose. Also, we were interested in finding what the time of death was.
The warm weather had taken its toll. There wasn't much left to collect. All that the police could tell was that the victim was female. She didn't easily surrender information about her death. Her clothing provided the first clue. County Coroner Richard Ulrich analyzed the remains.
The clothing was removed, and upon being removed was displayed and was examined further, and at this point in time it was felt that she suffered repeated stab wounds to the back through the clothing, which indicated blunt force sharp injury.
Next, the insect life colonizing the body was examined. The life cycles of flies and beetles can be used to estimate the time of death. The longer a body sits, the more generations of insects it nourishes. It was determined that the victim was killed between 19 and 25 days earlier. The dental records identified the victim as Lori Ocker, who had disappeared 19 days before, on May 24th. Lori Ocker and her son had moved back in with her parents after separating from her husband.
You know,
She was last seen leaving home at 3:30 for her job at a pet store in the mall. By 4 o'clock, she hadn't arrived at work. Her boss phoned her home to see where she was.
She left for work
Her mother was
a
concerned.
half hour ago.
She should have been there already. Thinking her car may have broken down, her parents retraced her route. They saw no sign of her until they arrived at the mall. Her car was parked near the entrance, but no trace of Lori was found until her body was recovered 19 days later. For almost 3 weeks, Lori Ocker was considered a missing person. But now her case was turned over to homicide, and attention shifted to finding her killer. Lori's mother told police that Lori had received threats from her estranged husband, Robert Ocker. The couple had been battling over custody of their son. Lori had been so afraid of Robert that she kept a shotgun under her bed for protection. He became the prime suspect. Shortly after Lori disappeared, police had questioned Robert Ocker. He told investigators that he'd been out running errands in his Plymouth Caravelle. He hadn't seen Lori. His parents, questioned later, agreed that he'd been out, but said he'd driven his mother's car, a 1984 Chevy Celebrity. At the time, the inconsistency meant nothing to investigators. Robert may have been lying because he wasn't covered on the Chevy's insurance. To prove Robert's involvement, they'd have to place him at the scene of the abduction. Police went to the mall to see if anyone had seen anything suspicious. They spoke to a teller at the bank next to the mall entrance. She suggested that perhaps the tape from the automatic teller machine held some clue, since it captured the portion of the parking lot where the victim parked her car.
Well, I don't remember seeing it, but...
An ATM camera snaps still images onto videotape at preset intervals. The camera at the mall where Ocker disappeared took a picture every 10 seconds. Lori Ocker had been missing 5 days by the time investigators were able to obtain the tape. The image, fuzzy but undeniable, was Ocker's car. Next to it was a figure, assumed to be Ocker. It was the next image, taken 10 seconds later, that caught investigators' attention.
The picture was not clear. The focus of the camera was on a person who was negotiating a transaction with the machine. Over his shoulder, deeper into the parking lot, was what we believe a scene of abduction.
The image showed a car crossing the victim's path. She's leaning into the car. In the next frame, the car is driving away, and Lori is gone. The car, though ghost-like, vaguely resembled the Chevy owned by Robert Ocker's mother. Robert Ocker was a suspect by virtue of the fact that he and Lori parted on such hostile terms. Lori feared for her life, but it appeared that Robert had managed to lure her into the car.
At the time of this abduction, Robert Ocker was exercising his first weekend of visitation, and he had in his custody the child. We absolutely have no statements to that effect, but circumstantially, we know that how devoted she was to that child. Is there any conceivable reason she would have gone into the car? Probably. If somebody would have told her that something was wrong with her child or she was needed, she might do it for that reason.
Investigators faced two obstacles linking the car to the homicide. First, the image on the ATM was too blurry to conclusively prove it was the Chevrolet. And second, Robert Ocker's father had sold the car 3 days after Lori Ocker disappeared. It had changed hands 4 times in the month since Ocker sold it. It was finally traced to its new owner, 90 miles away. Despite the fact that the car had been thoroughly cleaned prior to sale, the forensics team was able to raise clues from the vehicle. In a door gasket were strands of hair consistent with the victim's. It had pulp on the end, indicating that it didn't just fall out.
The question was, why would Lori Ocker's hair be there in a car not belonging to Robert Ocker, but belonging to the mother? We also had information that she seldom, if ever, was near that vehicle.
Clue by clue, the circumstantial evidence was building against Robert Ocker.
the rear light configuration. This is a much
But investigators knew that the case depended on identifying the vehicle on the tape.
Without any witnesses, our main witness in the case was the camera itself. Murder is not a spectator sport. You seldom get eyewitnesses to a murder.
Investigators tried the next best thing. They reconstructed the crime using the Ockers Chevy.
Any other ATM photographs that we're going to use?
They positioned it in the parking lot to approximate the unknown car, and they taped it with the same camera and focus as the ATM image. Then, the two images were compared. The results were encouraging, but inadequate to snuff reasonable doubt. The tape from the ATM wasn't enough. Investigators knew they needed to enhance the image, but in 1989, enhancement technology was in its infancy. They didn't know if it was possible to clean up the video. Sakavage contacted Eastman Kodak for help. They suggested NASA. If anyone on the planet had the ability to turn fuzzy images into hard evidence, it would be the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization at Kennedy Space Center. Principal investigator Alan Tietjen is in charge of analyzing images from shuttle launches for evaluation or troubleshooting. When the Pennsylvania State Police contacted him, he knew that enhancing the ATM tape wasn't rocket science, but it was close.
The process was very much the same. The source material was different in that videotape from a ATM machine is poorer quality than what we normally deal with.
Tietjen knew the quality of the image was too poor to identify faces or the license plate. The best he could hope for was to identify the car model. The image was loaded into a computer, which converted it into a digital image made of dots of light called pixels. 512 pixels per line, 512 lines per image. The process took 5 days. The computer, governed by a set of mathematical equations, manipulates the pixels, enhancing the picture.
There is no human intervention directing a specific result. The mathematics determine the result.
Each set of equations produces a different outcome. Tietjen had to be meticulous in his methods. He was setting a precedent. Never before had video enhancement been used in a capital case. He devoted 3 weeks to enhancing the ATM video. Once he completed it, he set to work enhancing the police reconstruction video. He used the same parameters for both in order to demonstrate that the images were in fact enhanced and not altered. Even with enhancement, the car in the original video wasn't perfectly clear. To make their case, investigators hired an expert from General Motors to identify the make and model of the car. He identified it as a Chevy Celebrity, model year 1983 or 84. Robert Ocker's mother drove a 1984 model. Sakavage had placed the Ocker's car and Robert Ocker at the crime scene. The image enhancement made his case. Based on the forensic evidence and the unambiguously enhanced images, Robert Ocker was sentenced to death for the kidnapping and murder of his estranged wife, Lori Ocker. The landmark case also established image enhancement as a powerful tool in the crime fighter's arsenal.
There are video cameras all around us. So they're capturing images, and whenever anything significant happens, now police are going to those cameras to try and capture some critical evidence, and now they're using digital imaging to try and get it enhanced to a point where it's more reliable than it would have otherwise been.
Every murder investigation is like a puzzle. Solving it requires finding the right pieces. But in a case in the Philippines, investigators had the pieces they needed. They just didn't know how to fit them together. In the pre-dawn hours of February 25, 1991, a disabled truck on a desolate road caught the eye of a taxi driver in Angela City, the Philippines. He stopped to assist the driver. He realized he had no help to offer. The woman behind the wheel was dead. When police arrived, the key was still in the ignition. The driver was still strapped into her seat. She was an American. Officials at nearby Clark Air Base were notified.
Calling Central, this is Chief Gindon. Pwedeng pakidala dito ng mga pulis para ma-check natin itong babae ito mukhang tiga Clark Air Base.
Life on the base is tight-knit. The first investigator on the scene thought he recognized the truck and its driver, a master sergeant's wife named Julie Snodgrass.
Tim Davis.
Office of Special Investigations Regional Forensic Consultant Lieutenant Colonel Tim Davis was summoned.
As we approached the truck, one of the agents came over and said, "Sir, I think it's Julie." When I walked up to the truck and looked in, I just said, "Oh my God!" And you don't forget those kind of things. I will tell you that. You just don't.
As an Air Force wife, Julie was a friendly face at picnics and parties, which she attended with her husband, Joe, and sometimes their 2 young children.
She was a good gal to be around, friendly, never knew an enemy. That's what I had a problem with when I was at the scene, was that I'd just seen Julie 2 days before, and I'd ask her, hey, I told her she looked great. She's got this great glow in her eyes, this great smile, and it's tough.
The glove box had been ransacked, its contents spilled across the seat and onto the floor. Superficially, it looked like a robbery, but it was too violent for that. The victim had been stabbed more than 40 times.
This was an act of violence. This wasn't an act of, hey lady, give me your purse. I'm going to steal your truck. It wasn't anything like that. This was an act that was done clearly to kill Julie.
The truck was carefully transported to a garage at the base where it was swabbed for blood that might belong to the killer. Hair and fibers were also collected. The sample were sent to the Army Crime Lab at Camp Zama, Japan. The results were disappointing. None of the blood, fibers, or hair found in the car pointed to anyone other than the victim. Investigators hoped that more significant clues were still to be found. The truck was carefully enclosed in a tent and fumed with superglue vapor, which exposes latent fingerprints. Some partial prints were lifted from the dashboard. They didn't belong to Julie or Joe Snodgrass, but the Philippines had no system to match fingerprints with known felons. It was another dead end. Besides the brutality of the crime, one question kept nagging at Davis. What was the victim doing in that part of town, especially at that hour?
If Julie went somewhere, generally it was on base only. Very rarely did Julie ever go off base.
The victim's husband, Joe Snodgrass, was questioned about the night of the murder. It was an awkward situation. Joe was in charge of managing all the evidence collected from crimes involving Air Force personnel in the Philippines. Because of his personal connection, the murder of his wife was one case he was not cataloging.
Joe, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. Where were you?
Snodgrass told investigators that he and Julie argued. She stormed out.
Well, that day I was out
He called
shopping
several
with
of
my
her
wife,
friends to see if they'd seen or heard from
we had
her.
a fight, and
He
we
even
pretty
kept a
much fought
log
the
of the
remainder
calls
day,
he'd
so
made.
around 10:30 she just left.
That level of attention to
So I
detail
just
raised
back to the
suspicions.
If you're watching and you believe in the TV cop stuff, primarily one of the things that a guilty person does is keep a log of the phone calls. So you just think, oh, come on, this is too obvious here, but he actually did.
Joe and Julie Snodgrass had a history of domestic problems. In fact, a year earlier, Julie had divorced Joe and moved back to the States with their children. Joe had convinced her to come back to him 1 month before her death.
Okay, what kind of job do you do?
To see if their relationship was souring once again, investigators spoke to their housekeeper.
And I take care of the children.
She was nervous and unable to offer any information about the Snodgrasses' relationship.
Where you at?
Considering her daily interactions with the family, that seemed strange. Investigators had no evidence to justify their suspicions about Joe Snodgrass. Then, the housekeeper decided to come clean.
So, Lucy, what did you do?
Just as the investigation into the murder of Julie Snodgrass was hitting a wall, the timid young housekeeper broke the case open.
What did you do with the letter?
She admitted to having an affair with Joe Snodgrass. More than that, she told investigators that he had written her a letter asking her to hire her relatives to kill Julie Snodgrass.
He asked me to find somebody to kill her. And he wanted me to find.
She destroyed it. But her word was enough to get a warrant to search Joe's office.
Did you get to find your relative?
Investigators confiscated some handwritten letters and computer floppy disks from his office.
Yeah. Keep looking back here. Okay.
Then, as a matter of legal procedure, Snodgrass was called in to identify the items collected in order to establish ownership.
Nothing? What's that?
When presented with the floppy disks, Snodgrass suddenly lunged forward and pulled something out of his pocket.
We heard one of the agents call out he has a weapon, and at that time, a number of agents who were armed ran by us and ran to the interview room. And then it was determined at that point that Joe had a pair of scissors.
Snodgrass had concealed a pair of pinking shears.
He had grabbed the disc all in basically one motion. This was like flash second stuff. And Joe began to cut the disc up into pieces. This is evidence. This is not supposed to happen, but it did.
The disks obviously contained something incriminating. Could their data be salvaged? Davis wasn't hopeful.
I mean, you've taken something that was intact, and now it's in 20-some pieces. And in your mind, it's there in a sense becomes 23 more pieces of evidence. How do you deal with it?
That was the question of the hour. No one had ever dealt with anything quite like it before. He sent the fragments to the Department of Defense Computer Forensics Laboratory in Washington, D.C. They became the responsibility of Special Agent Jim Christie of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations.
From the time I got the initial phone call from the Philippines, we had all our computer crime investigators out trying to find someone who had a technique to recover the data, because no one had ever tried that before. You're gonna like this.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So it's just from the Philippines.
Not only were the discs cut up, each piece was crumpled as well.
Cool. No problem.
Christie shopped the discs to private companies, to other law enforcement agencies, to the FBI. Each politely declined. saying the task was impossible or staggeringly expensive.
So when my deputy, Ed Cutchins, and I, we drove around the Beltway, picked up our disc, and we're driving back around the Beltway and coming back to the headquarters here, and Ed said, okay, you've let everybody else have a shot at this, you're going to let me have a shot. And I said, what are you going to do? He says, well, I'm going to Scotch tape them back together. And I won't tell you what I told him at that point.
They experimented with blank formatted discs, cutting them, taping them back together, and slipping them into a drive to see if the data were still readable. The first attempt was disappointing.
So we turned it on, and I watched my disk drive bounce across the table for about 10-15 seconds till the read-write heads ripped off.
Before they tried again, investigators placed a second floppy underneath the taped floppy to cover up the seams. They saw their first glimmer of progress. The disk drive survived. But before they could apply the technique to the actual disk fragments, they had to flatten them out. Once again, brainstorming and intensive trial and error brought results. A soldering iron placed in a section of aluminum tubing provided the right amount of heat and pressure to flatten the fragile sheet. Once the segments were flattened, investigators had to try to read them. They knew they might only have one chance, so when putting the pieces together, they erred on the side of caution.
We were afraid that if we put them all together, that if one piece ripped and caught the head, it might tear up the other evidence. So we decided to create host diskettes, what we called host diskettes, for each piece.
Each fragment was spliced onto its own separate host diskette and read individually. 23 fragments, 23 host diskettes. One chance to catch a killer. Computer forensics experts in Washington, D.C. puzzled over how to assemble the pieces of the mutilated diskettes in order to solve a murder. Some of the fragments were so small, investigators didn't know how to align them on the disk. These more troublesome pieces were sprayed with a solution called Magna-C. The magnetic spray dries to a powder and reveals the magnetic tracks on the disk fragments. Once the fragment was properly aligned on the host diskette, the powder was brushed away. Finally, came time to read the fragments. To analyze and display the bits and pieces of data, investigators relied on a software package called AnaDisk, developed for law enforcement. AnaDisk kept a trail of the separate segments of data and displayed them on the screen so they could be combined. The pieces, in more ways than one, were falling into place. But the splices still caused problems. Information on a diskette is tightly packed. Whenever the disk drive head hit a splice, it lost contact with the disk and missed large chunks of data. For this high-tech problem, an assistant supplied a low-tech solution.
Well, what he did was he just put his finger on the head, just like you would put a penny or a coin on an old photograph if you got stuck. And by putting his finger on it and rereading that sector, the head didn't bounce, and we were able to get more data.
Investigators found love letters Snodgrass wrote to his wife and to his mistress, along with letters to his insurance company requesting an increase in Julie Snodgrass's coverage. They also recovered information linking Joe to an elaborate black market scheme. But what they found next was akin to a signed confession.
We found a last paragraph of a letter talking about his girlfriend hiring the hitman, him asking his girlfriend to hire hitmen, which she did.
It had taken 5 weeks, but the DoD Forensics Lab had achieved what was thought to be impossible. They had resurrected data that enabled a brutal murder to be avenged, and in the process developed a set of procedures for others to follow. Experts said the cost could reach into the millions. They spent $131. The information they gathered was sent back to Lieutenant Colonel Davis in the Philippines.
For me? Great. I'll tell you flat out, had we probably not had that, we'd have had a tougher case to prove. But with the documentation that was recovered from that disc, there was no mistake. We had Joe.
Investigators reconstructed the likely course of events that led up to the murder. Joe Snodgrass, who was very controlling of his wife, had convinced her to deliver some money he owed to one of his black market contacts. He told her to pick up 2 of his Confederates and to drive them to the drop-off point. She complied. She didn't know that the men she picked up were the ones hired to murder her. They were the relatives of the Snodgrass's housekeeper. Trusting them, she drove to a secluded spot. Then they killed her.
Felix, can you tell us what happened that night?
I didn't. Sorry, sir.
They confessed to the crime and received 20 years. The housekeeper received probation.
I'll do it this last time, but not anymore.
And for masterminding the crime, Joe Snodgrass received life in prison.
You never stop and think that you would end up investigating one of your own for murder or being involved in the conspiracy to commit murder. It never crosses your mind, not once.
The technology that simplifies our lives has also made it harder for us to pass unnoticed. In almost everything we do, we leave behind an electronic trail as solid as footprints and as individual as our own face. When a crime occurs unseen by human eyes, investigators can invoke an electronic witness. Firefighters extinguish a blazing house in the nick of time, exposing the murders the fire was meant to conceal. A woman's death in her bathtub looks like an accident, at least at first. Investigating a reported suicide, police in New Orleans find certain details suspiciously out of place. Killers can be masters at disguising their crimes, even when their victims are in plain sight. It takes a vigilant investigator to realize that first impressions are often dead wrong. In the small town of Benton, Virginia, on August 29, 1994, a passing motorist saw smoke rising from a house just before dawn. Firefighters battled the blaze for several hours before bringing it under control.
Okay, can you give me your status? You making any headway on the fire? Yeah, we got most of it knocked down. We're still negative on a search.
The patterns of the burns and the speed at which the fire spread told them this was arson. Had the motorist not called when he did, the house and all it contained would have been destroyed beyond recognition. The fire team was not in time to save the family who lived there. 4 people, including 2 small children, were dead.
11C, go ahead, back your hay line out of the building.
But once the smoke cleared and smoldering ruins were examined, it became apparent that this family did not die in the fire. Downstairs, Teresa Hodges had been strangled. Upstairs, 11-year-old Winter Hodges and 3-year-old Anna Hodges had been shot. In the master bedroom, the body of their father, Blaine Hodges, was found with a single gunshot to the head. A .22 caliber pistol without a barrel lay near his body. Special Agent Barry Cassie of the Virginia State Police had a theory about what happened.
It was pretty obvious that the evidence was just screaming, that's the words I use, of murder-suicide. And as the morning wore on, it became even more evident that it was a murder-suicide.
Blaine Hodges had recently been convicted of embezzling from his employer, the United States Postal Service. Police believed that Blaine, despondent over his impending prison sentence, had killed his wife and his children. Then he doused their home with fuel oil, set it afire, and shot himself in the head. At autopsy, Dr. David Oxley, Deputy Chief Medical Examiner of Western Virginia, began to doubt the murder-suicide theory.
Well, when I examined the bodies, all 4 of the bodies, I noticed the thing that struck me was that the man, Blaine Hodges, had been dead considerably longer than the other 3. The body of Mr. Hodges was quite decomposed. The other bodies were not. What do we know so far?
Oxley told Special Agent Cassie that Blaine Hodges couldn't have killed his family.
24 to 36 hours, find out what
He'd died at least 12 hours earlier than they did. The gun collected at the scene also raised questions. The bullets retrieved from the victims were all .22 caliber, the same as the pistol retrieved next to Blaine Hodges. The pistol serial number had been filed off, making it impossible to trace. Its missing barrel also hampered investigators. A gun barrel leaves spiral marks called lands and grooves on every bullet that passes through. The bullets recovered from the victims had these markings, meaning they came from a gun with a barrel. Forensic Supervisor William Conrad of the Virginia Division of Forensic Science was convinced that someone besides Blaine Hodges must have pulled the trigger.
With the barrel removed and rifling being present on the father's bullet that was taken from his head, would indicate right away that he could not have fired that shot. There's no way he could have shot himself in the head and then removed the barrel. That wouldn't have happened.
Conrad wasn't convinced this was even the real murder weapon. The bullets taken from the bodies were marked with 6 lands and grooves. Reference manuals for the gun found at the crime scene showed its normal pattern would be 8 lands and grooves. Conrad concluded the gun found at the crime scene was merely a drop gun, intended to fool the police.
At a crime scene, if you're trying to frame someone or try to cover something up, you would drop a gun that's unrelated to the incident and try to trick us into thinking that was the actual weapon.
What looked like a murder-suicide at the crime scene had morphed into plain murder in the forensics lab. Aside from tipping detectives off, the gun was of little use at this stage in the investigation. They had no suspects, no ballistics to compare, and apparently not even the murder weapon. All that detectives could be sure of was that someone else had killed the family, then tried to make it appear like murder-suicide. The killer had hoped the flames would consume the evidence. Detectives sifting through the ashes at the crime scene now had a new assignment: to smoke out the killer. Police had no idea who killed the Hodges and their 2 daughters. They questioned friends, hoping to gather clues about their enemies. Their closest friend was a man named Earl Bramblett. He frequently stayed with the family. The kids called him Uncle Earl. Police asked Bramblett to come to the station and talk with them.
Thank you, Kessler. Nice to meet you. I appreciate you coming down.
He seemed genuinely upset about the deaths. But in the course of his interview, an offhanded comment caught investigators by surprise.
He spontaneously made a comment, and he said that sorry SOB, he had a beautiful family. He did them and did himself. Well, at that moment, I knew Mr. Bramblett was probably involved in the murders of the Hodges family. I knew that in order for somebody to know that outside of the police, that they would have had to have been in there when the murders occurred.
The media hadn't reported the murder-suicide story, and the police hadn't mentioned it to anyone outside of the force. Bramblett had revealed a detail only the killer would have known. Gussie kept his suspicions to himself. He needed more evidence before he could act on them. Bramblett agreed to come in for another interview later. When he failed to show, the police went to the motel where he was staying since he had no fixed address. When he didn't answer the door, the detectives obtained a room key from the motel manager to make sure he was all right. Bramblett arrived just in time to stop them. Now belligerent, he dared them to place him under arrest. To the police, he was behaving like a man who was guilty.
You want to arrest? You think I done something wrong?
And who believed the police would never be able to prove it. Bramblett's own words had made him a suspect, but words alone proved nothing. Three days after the Hodges family were killed, police set up a roadblock in front of the house. The fire had started around 4:30 a.m. By stopping cars around that time, they hoped to find someone who may have passed the house just before it burned. A woman told police she saw a vehicle pull out of the Hodges driveway at the time of the fire. She noticed the vehicle because it was so unusual. An old white pickup truck with a black tailgate. She did not notice the license number or the driver.
Earl, said we'd be back. A search warrant to look at your truck and your room. Care to read it?
While the roadblock was taking place, police returned to Bramblett's motel room with a search warrant. As Bramblett stood by, they searched for anything that might suggest his involvement in the deaths of Blaine Hodges and his family. Outside stood his white pickup truck with its distinctive black tailgate. In the front seat, police saw several .22 caliber shell casings. They were the same brand and caliber as the casings found at the murder scene. When the firing pin strikes a bullet, it leaves a distinct impression on the cartridge casing. William Conrad hoped to compare the casings from the crime scene with the ones found in Bramblett's truck. Once again, he found the killer was one step ahead of him. He'd obscured the marks on the cartridges.
It looked like someone had placed it in, fired the gun, took them out, placed them again, and fired them. Again, it indicated that someone was trying to manipulate the evidence after the fact to try to confuse the laboratory and what was going on.
Conrad would not be so easily thwarted. Among the hash of wayward marks, he looked for similarities between the cartridges retrieved from the truck and those from the murder scene.
We can put the marks together, see the reproducible patterns that are present, and be able to say that the marks that you see represented on both of them were made by the same firing pin impression.
After close scrutiny, he found what he was looking for. One of the cartridges from the crime scene had a strike mark identical to a cartridge from Bramblett's truck.
And I found enough of those individual characteristics that I was able to say that both of them had been fired by the same firing pin, to the exclusion of any others.
The cartridge casings were definitely used in the same gun. linking the drop gun to Bramblett. But that wasn't enough. Conrad still needed to find the gun that fired the fatal bullets. Meantime, detectives worked the case from another angle, trying to find out if Bramblett could have been the one who set the fire. The killer had torched the house around 4:30 a.m. on Monday, August 29th. To check Bramblett's whereabouts at that time, police went to the sign company where he worked. They learned he was scheduled to be at work at 5 a.m. the day of the fire.
The same employee that routinely checks the time cards checked Mr. Bramlett's. Mr. Bramlett's card had been obliterated. That the time that he punched in on Monday morning, August the 29th, had been blacked out where you couldn't read what time he might have punched in.
Police called on handwriting expert Gordon Menzies to find out what was under the marking.
Using infrared lighting techniques, I was able to separate the ink of the overwritten entry or the obliterating entry and come up with an entry of 508M, which was apparently 8 minutes after 5 Monday.
The time card confirmed that Bramblett arrived at work after the blaze was set. But that didn't prove he was the one who set it. It only proved he had time to do it. The search for more evidence continued. Bramblett's employer told police that the morning after police searched Bramblett's motel room, Earl arrived at work seething with rage. 1 hour later, a co-worker noticed water running under a door. He found a pair of blue jeans thought to be Bramblett's. They smelled of the solvent used at the sign company. The manager thought them important enough to turn over to the police. Authorities hoped the jeans still held some clue to link Bramblett to the fire. Scientists analyzed them and the water they were soaking in. To identify the chemicals in the fabric, the jeans were placed in a canister with a solvent called pentane. After they had soaked for 15 minutes, the pentane was poured off. The solvent evaporated under a fume hood, leaving behind a soup of the compounds from the jeans. The liquid was placed in a gas chromatograph. A readout identified each compound soaked out of the jeans. One was a commercial solvent used by the sign company. The other was fuel oil, like that used to douse the home of the murder victims. Investigators believed that Bramblett had tried to rinse the oil-soaked jeans clean, carelessly leaving them where anyone could find them. Though the jeans were potential evidence, they were, like everything else so far, circumstantial. Investigators pressed on. Hoping that Bramblett's carelessness didn't stop there, they looked for more evidence in the dumpster at the sign company. Along with documents belonging to Bramblett, they found a T-shirt bearing the words William Byrd High School, class of 2001. One of the murder victims, 11-year-old Winter Hodges, owns such a T-shirt. It was missing from the crime scene and unaccounted for. The shirt found in the dumpster had apparently belonged to the victim. Investigators were encouraged. Only Bramblett would have had access to both the shirt and the dumpster. Still, it proved no wrongdoing. As the investigation into the deaths of the Hodges continued, Bramblett left town for good. Though Virginia police never let him out of their sight, they believed they had nothing to hold him. they didn't realize they had what they needed all along. Police were reasonably certain that Earl Bramblett killed the Hodges family, but that means nothing in a court of law. To prove it, they had to place him at the scene. The gun seemed to be the crucial element. They just didn't know how it fit. The killer had taken pains to make sure the weapon couldn't be identified. Without a serial number, it couldn't be traced. Without a barrel, investigators had no way to perform a ballistics test. They had no reason to believe that the gun from the crime scene was the murder weapon. According to William Conrad's reference manual, a bullet fired from this gun would show 8 lands and grooves. The bullets recovered from the Hodges showed only 6. The weapon sat on a shelf for a year while the case against Bramblett stalled. Then, on an unrelated investigation, Conrad ran across a weapon of the same brand as the gun in the Bramblett case. He test-fired the gun and was surprised to find that the bullets had 6 lands and grooves instead of 8. The reference manual had been wrong. Conrad now knew that the gun found in the Hodges house most likely was the murder weapon. The killer had removed its barrel because he thought it would make the gun untraceable. But through the cartridge casings and other forensic evidence, police found their man. By linking the gun to Earl Bramblett, the police had gathered the final piece of evidence they needed to prove he was the killer. Then, his sister in Indiana provided information about the possible motive. Bramblett, apparently feeling threatened, had sent her a huge number of audio tapes for safekeeping. He told her to send them to police if something happened to him. When she heard her brother was in trouble, she forwarded them to the Virginia authorities. In his audio-taped diaries, Bramblett spoke of his more than casual attraction to the Hodges' 11-year-old daughter. Bramblett had once been a suspect in the disappearance of 2 small children, but his involvement had never been proved. According to the tapes, Bramblett began to believe that Blaine Hodges, faced with prison for embezzling, had become a police informant. In his delusions, Bramblett had decided Blaine was using his daughter to entrap Bramblett as a child molester. The police believed that on Saturday, August 27, 1994, Bramblett had been visiting Blaine at his home. While Teresa Hodges and her children were out shopping, he took his .22 Magnum pistol and shot Blaine in the head. According to friends who saw them later that day, Bramblett told Teresa when she came home from shopping that Blaine, despondent over going to prison, needed some time by himself.
Blaine took off.
Like the good uncle he pretended to be, he bundled Teresa and the children into his truck and took them camping in the nearby mountains. As Blaine Hodges lay dead in an upstairs bedroom, his wife and children went off with his killer. They would have only a 24-hour reprieve. The next day, Bramblett would resume his killing by strangling Teresa Hodges. Having killed both parents, Bramblett saved his last horrifying act of violence for the children. He then put the murder weapon next to Blaine Hodges' body to make it appear that Blaine had killed his family, then himself. He was sure the fuel he spread throughout the house would ignite an all-consuming fire, that the police would buy the theory of murder-suicide. But Bramblett had no sooner made his getaway than a passing motorist spotted the flames and called the fire department. Special Agent Barry Cassee acknowledges that Bramblett almost got away with it.
His primary plan was, if the police buy this murder-suicide, I'm home free. And look, he would have been home free. But see, he did not know that the Benton Fire Department had responded in such a short order that they preserved the bodies upstairs.
It took the police almost 2 years to build their case. Bramlett had relocated to South Carolina, but the Virginia authorities had never lost his trail. He was arrested in July 1996, convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Killers can disguise their crimes in many ways, but the truth often lies just below the surface. On April 29, 1997, police in the suburban Philadelphia community of Marion, Pennsylvania, arrived at the house of Craig Rabinowitz. He'd called 911 to report his wife unconscious in the bathtub. They found Rabinowitz clutching his wife, Stephanie, still in the tub where he'd found her. He told police he'd discovered his wife on her side, her head underwater. He had no idea what caused his wife to drown. Paramedics tried to revive her, but she was dead. Detective Charlie Craig saw no signs of foul play in the death of Mrs. Rabinowitz.
My initial impression of the cause of death, after looking at Stephanie, after viewing her at the emergency ward, and after talking with the emergency ward doctor, was that it was an unexplained death or it was an accident.
All right, here we go.
What are you doing?
Oh, come on.
Friends and relatives mourned the untimely death of a woman in the prime of life. Craig and Stephanie had met when he was a camp counselor and she was still a teenager. After they married, Stephanie went to law school and had a promising career as an attorney. To their friends, they seemed an ideal couple. Now, their happiness had come to a tragic end. Craig told police that on the night of his wife's death, he was watching a hockey game while she took a bath. He heard a thump coming from the bathroom, like the sound of a shampoo bottle hitting the floor. When his wife failed to emerge from the bath after 35 minutes, he went to check on her. That's when he found her submerged in the water, her face blue. He tried desperately to bring her back to life, then called 911. Detectives have an eye for inconsistencies. And though they had no reason to doubt that the death was an accident, one fact seemed bothersome. The paramedics mentioned that the victim was wearing jewelry, including a watch. Charlie Craig's partner, Detective Richard Peffel, asked some of his female friends if they bathed with their jewelry.
And almost exclusively, every woman said, absolutely not. The first one I did was the first night I got home about 4 a.m. and I woke up my wife from a dead sleep. Nance, if you took a bath, would you wear all of your jewelry? And she looked at me and said, no, why? And I said, don't worry about it, go back to sleep.
That eccentric detail motivated investigators to look for other inconsistencies. They checked the hospital records. Again, something didn't sit right. After death, a body's temperature normally drops at the rate of 1 degree per hour, even faster if it's sitting in water. When the victim arrived at the hospital, her temperature was only 1 degree below normal, indicating she died just 10 minutes before the call to 911. Her husband's estimate that 35 minutes passed after he heard a thump in the bathroom didn't add up. While detectives' suspicions were mounting, Chief Coroner Halbert Fillinger requested an autopsy to find out why the healthy 29-year-old died so suddenly. Craig Rabinowitz refused to allow it, asserting that Jewish law demands that the body be interred before sundown the day after death, and it must remain intact. But in cases of mysterious or sudden death, the coroner can overrule religious objections unless he's given a court order.
Because of their Jewish faith, Stephanie should have been buried before the next sundown. And Dr. Fillinger was pressured by the family to release Stephanie's body so that she could be buried in accordance with her faith. And Dr. Fillinger was persistent that the body would not be released until a complete autopsy was committed.
When the body was brought in, it showed no marks, not even a bruise to indicate how the victim fell. According to Fillinger, that's not unusual.
There are injuries on the front of the body, and they occurred just prior to death or a short time prior to death. And you examine the body right after death, you may not see anything at all.
But by the time the autopsy was conducted, 12 hours after she died, the victim's wounds began to reveal themselves and the truth about her death. The medical examiners believed they were about to begin a routine autopsy on the victim of a mysterious death. Though the circumstances were tragic, examiners didn't expect them to be criminal. But they soon found themselves face to face with homicide. The first indication of foul play came with a look at the skin below the victim's eyes, where bruises made a silent accusation.
But as the blood drains away from those sites of injury, leaving the surrounding skin quite pale, then the area of bruising stands up like a beacon in the night.
Bruises such as these come from lack of oxygen, most often when a victim chokes or is choked. Strangulation was a possibility worth looking into. The victim showed no external marks around her neck, but beneath the skin, the tissue damage confirmed Fillinger's suspicions.
And of course, when we first got the body open, we found the evidence of severe strangulation, a great deal of trauma in the neck.
The mystery of Stephanie Rabinowitz's sudden death had been solved, and a homicide investigation had begun. Detectives Charlie Craig and Richard Peffel, along with prosecutor Bruce Castor, had their prime suspect, the victim's husband, Craig Rabinowitz. They questioned him in the presence of his attorney.
When Charlie came back in and advised both Rabinowitz and the attorney that Stephanie had in fact died from manual strangulation, the attorney jumped up and said, "Oh my God, she strangled herself." And both Charlie and I looked at the attorney and I said, "I don't think so."
The Rabinowitz marriage seemed picture perfect. What could have driven Craig Rabinowitz to kill his wife? Police obtained a warrant to search the house for some sign of a motive. While his wife worked as a lawyer, Craig had supposedly run a business from his home. He convinced a number of his friends to invest in his promising venture. But a search of the house showed no evidence of a business being conducted there. Detectives had almost given up when one of the officers found a plastic bag in a crawl space above a closet. The bag was filled with receipts and financial records. They revealed that Craig Rabinowitz had been living a lie.
When we went through the bag, we found some pretty important items, including a list or ledger. We also found other receipts from pawn shops indicating that some jewelry had recently been pawned. And we also found receipts from furniture stores, the furniture that he had bought, apparently another woman. So during this whole case, he was pictured to be this loving, happy, devoted husband, and in this bag, we found otherwise.
A forensic accountant, skilled in deciphering complex financial transactions, reviewed the records. He found that what Craig had called a business was in fact a con game. He'd swindled his investors and convinced his trusting wife to remortgage their home. He then spent the money not on business, but to support his secret life. Credit card bills totaling $54,000 came from a single location, a strip club in Philadelphia. He'd been seeing one of the dancers there, showering her with gifts. At the time of his wife's death, Craig was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Desperate for money, Craig had taken out 2 insurance policies, each for $1.5 million. One was for his own life, the other for his wife. In a ledger found in the attic, Craig had calculated his net worth in the event his wife died, proving the crime was premeditated. After collecting on the insurance and paying off his debts, he'd have $1.2 million to spare. At the end of his rope, Craig turned on his unsuspecting wife and strangled her to death. He filled the bathtub, hoping to create the appearance of an accidental drowning. Then he called the police. It seemed like such a simple plan. According to Charlie Craig, far too simple.
A lot of people said to me, you know, this guy must have seen this in a movie or read it in a book. Well, as it was coming close to trial, that kind of stuck in my mind, and I got the photos back out because I remembered there was some book that had something to do with death.
A book on Rabinowitz's desk had looked out of place when police searched his home. The author claimed that few deaths are followed by an autopsy.
Craig Rabinowitz was a con man. When he learned this information, that only 13% of the deaths are autopsied, Craig Rabinowitz was playing a con. He was playing the odds when he learned that information, that the odds were dramatically in his favor that Stephanie wouldn't be autopsied.
But an autopsy had been performed, exposing Craig Rabinowitz as a con man who'd gotten in too deeply. For murdering his wife, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lurid events take on a life of their own. On the streets of any town, people love a good scandal, especially when it involves respectable citizens. In New Orleans, a town not easily shocked, investigators found themselves in the middle of a scandal that made the Big Easy a little queasy. Just after dawn on January 22, 1984, 62-year-old Aaron Mintz frantically summoned his neighbor, a doctor. Mintz exclaimed that his wife had just shot herself. The 2 men rushed upstairs to the master bedroom. There, the doctor found Pam Mintz lying face up on her pillow, a bullet hole in the right side of her head. In her hand was a pistol. The doctor checked for vital signs as Mintz waited anxiously nearby. Solemnly, the doctor informed Aaron Mintz that Pam Mintz, the woman he'd been married to for 33 years, was dead. The doctor called the police to notify them of the suicide. They arrived to make a report. Detective John Dillman led the investigation.
Shortly before daybreak, or right at dawn, I received the call of a suicide at the residence of Aaron Mintz. Proceeded to that location, thinking that I was going to handle a suicide.
Investigators assessed the scene, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. But the position of her body didn't look right. They suspected the victim had been moved.
Pam's right elbow was bent in an upwards direction, like this, with 2 blood stains on the bottom of her forearm, coming up to a point on both sides. I questioned those stains as soon as I saw them because, as we all know, blood can't run uphill. It's against gravity.
The angle of the gun in the dead woman's hand also aroused the investigators' suspicions. It looked as though it was placed in her hand after the fact.
The gun was positioned and this is unloaded, by the way. The gun was positioned in her hand, bent in this position, close to her head, where it would have been almost impossible to pull the trigger except with a thumb. The gun was clutched very loosely, indicating to me that the arm had been, which had originally been lying on the bed, had been bent at the elbow and raised into that position, and then the weapon had been placed into her hand to make it appear to be a suicide.
Beginning to doubt that this was truly a suicide, detectives looked for other signs of foul play. They found blood smeared on the bathroom light switch. The victim, who died instantly, couldn't have left it. And by his own admission, Aaron Mintz was the only other person in the house. But even that discovery paled in comparison to what detectives discovered next. In another bedroom, they found a pillow with a bullet hole in it. On one side were powder burns. The other side was flecked with blood. Detective Dillman was convinced that the victim was murdered and the pillow used to muffle the shot.
But once I followed this blood trail into the front of the house and found the pillow that was hidden, it didn't take a brain surgeon to, I mean, a big light just blew off. You know, John, this isn't a suicide, you have a murder on your hands.
Police launched a full-scale homicide investigation. The case seemed open and shut. The immediate suspect was the victim's husband, Aaron. There had been no one else in the house. The alarm had not been tripped. Aaron Mintz was a prominent member of the community. He denied murdering his wife. Anxious to clear his name, Mintz agreed that same day to have his hands tested for traces of gunpowder and gunmetal. If he'd fired the gun, the residue would cling to his skin. But Aaron admitted he had washed his hands before the test was conducted. The results were negative. The test failed to prove Aaron killed his wife, but neither did it prove him innocent. Investigators turned their attention to the evidence collected at the house. They focused on the bloodied pillow found in the other bedroom and the switchblade from the bathroom. In 1984, when the crime occurred, DNA testing was not yet available. But the blood type matched the victim's. Blood smears on the front and sleeve of Aaron's bathrobe also matched. Police theorized that blood got on the robe when Aaron rearranged the body. His sleeve probably touched the light switch when he went to wash his hands.
All right, so you went downstairs. You relaxed, watched a little TV, and then fell asleep?
Yes.
And what happened then?
It didn't take much digging for police to determine a possible motive. They learned that Mintz was having an affair with a young woman named Lois Porsche. Pam Mintz found out about her husband's infidelity 2 weeks before her death. She angrily confronted Aaron. She wouldn't let him go without a fight.
She didn't want him embarrassing her in public. And when Aaron began showing up in the circles of their friends with the girl that he was having the affair with, she became irate. She was going to take him for everything he was worth. And he knew it.
Investigators suspected that Aaron killed Pam so he could be free of the marriage without losing his fortune. According to their scenario, Aaron had gone to his wife's bedroom after she'd fallen asleep. He shot her in the head, using the pillow to muffle the sound so as not to alert the neighbors. That would have bought him plenty of time to rearrange the scene, making murder look like suicide. Mintz was charged with murder. To handle his defense, he hired prominent New Orleans attorney Michael Fowler. Like most of those who knew the accused, Fowler was surprised by his arrest.
I would found it most unlikely, that he would have been a subject of a homicide investigation. But by the same token, I didn't know that he was having an affair.
The case was sensationalized in the local press, which gave major coverage to the blood-stained pillow. In the court of public opinion, Aaron's guilt was a foregone conclusion. But in a court of law, the prosecution faced a serious challenge.
You realized that you had an ability to win this case, but you had to do it in terms of the forensics. You had to be able to negate a bunch of different things.
To clear Aaron Mintz, the defense relied on forensics to dismantle the prosecution's case, one piece at a time. A blood-stained bathrobe, a smeared light switch, and a bullet-pierced pillow. This was the evidence presented in the death of Pam Mintz.
I went upstairs and I found Palmer. We've been over this before.
I know that.
To the prosecution, it pointed to Aaron Mintz as a murderer.
I saw my wife dead on the bed.
But the defense saw things differently. They began with Aaron's bathrobe, smeared with his wife's blood. Aaron claimed he'd been dozing in front of the TV downstairs in the early morning. Startled awake by a loud noise, he went to investigate. When he found his wife's body and the gun in her hand, his first reaction was to take her in his arms, hugging her. According to defense attorney Michael Fowler, this scenario also explains the blood on the light switch.
After Aaron had embraced his wife, he turned the light on as he was exiting the room, made every reason why there would be blood there. There was blood on the light switch in the bathroom. That made sense because at a point he went into the bathroom and washed his hands.
The scenario explained away all but the most dramatic piece of evidence, the gunshot pillow. The prosecution argued that Aaron Mintz used the pillow to silence his gun, then removed it from Pam's bedside to conceal his crime. Again, the defense countered. Innocent of any crime, in a state of shock on discovering his wife's body, Aaron removed the pillow almost in a daze. He merely wanted to get it out of his sight without thinking how it might appear to police.
It's only significant if it's a pillow that was used in a homicide. If it's not a pillow that's used in a homicide, it's like a dirty sock. What difference does it make? You know, he just removes it. I mean, we all do crazy things when we're under a great deal of stress.
The defense argued that since Aaron put the pillow where anyone could have found it, his purpose was not concealment.
If he wanted to hide it, he could have hid it. There was a house that sort of was full of nooks and crannies and attic space and all, and he just put it in this other room.
The defense was determined to discount the pillow completely. They stuck with the idea that Pam Mintz killed herself, but they asserted that the fatal bullet wasn't fired through the pillow. The defense had the pillow examined by Irving Stone of the Southwestern Institute for Forensic Sciences in Dallas. He set out to ascertain whether the fatal bullet was in fact fired through the pillow, as police had assumed. Using a weapon of the same caliber as the gun that killed Pam Mintz, Stone conducted tests to simulate what would happen if a gun were fired through a pillow into a human head. As a target, he used a sponge soaked in simulated blood within a heavy plastic bag. Stone shot the bag through the pillow from various distances. He demonstrated that if a pillow had been used to muffle the fatal shot, a great deal more of the victim's blood would have ended up on the pillowcase.
What would have happened as the bullet passed through the pillow into the head, with the pillow being 6 to 10 inches from the head, then there would have been back spatter of blood that would have spattered back on the reverse side of the pillow. Well, there was none of this there.
The blood on the pillow at the crime scene was hardly noticeable. By contrast, in the laboratory, blood was spattered and stained over a wide area. Stone also showed that a bullet fired through a pillow would have left fragments of the pillow behind.
You expect to find cloth, fibers, some other type of polymeric fill material at or around the wound, and actually into the wound itself. I've seen where cloth fragments have been caught by the bullet and just carried right into the wound.
There were no reports of pillow fragments on the bed where the victim was found. Likewise, the coroner found no traces of the pillow in the wound. For Stone, there was only one conclusion. The fatal bullet was not fired through the pillow. But a nagging question remained. What was the pillow doing there in the first place?
On the one hand, we had no obligation to explain the pillow. Once we were able to explain it was not used in a murder, in a homicide. On the other hand, it was there, and we had to deal with it.
The prosecution had portrayed the victim as a wronged woman, murdered so her husband could pursue his affair. But the defense painted an entirely different picture. They portrayed Pam Mintz as a vindictive woman with a long history of emotional distress. Her husband's betrayal had been too much to bear, the defense asserted. She plotted the ultimate revenge. She would kill herself, but in the process, she'd frame her husband for murder. The gunshot pillow would play a starring role. The Mintz's housekeeper testified that she'd seen the victim leaving the house the day before she died, carrying what appeared to be a pillow along with the dry cleaning. Earlier in the day, she'd seen a gun lying on Mrs. Mintz's bed. The defense suggested to the jury that Pam, out for revenge, fired a bullet through the pillow herself. Then she left it at her bedside as she prepared to end her life, knowing that it would appear that her husband had killed her. But there was no way to prove the victim had fired a pistol the day of her death. The police had made no attempt to test her hands for traces of gunpowder. Fowler believes this was a critical mistake.
Despite the fact that she was then undergoing an autopsy, or was about to undergo an autopsy, and her hands had been bagged, the police lab never swabbed her hands, so nobody ever knew, and to this day they never know if there was any residue on her hands. They had every opportunity to do it, they just didn't do it.
If a test had shown that Pam did not fire the gun, the police would have had clear evidence the case was not a suicide. If the test had shown Pam did fire the gun, it would have cleared Aaron of guilt. But Dillman thinks the test results might have been misleading.
I did not order testing on a trace metal test on Pam Mintz's hand due to the fact that it really was irrelevant. We knew that the gun had been placed in her hands, metal had touched her hands, so any type of a trace metal test would have proved positive. That didn't prove anything.
When the case went to trial, the prosecution was confident of the evidence it presented. But the jury found otherwise, accepting the defendant's version of what happened the night Pam Mintz died. The defense claimed she'd put a bullet hole in a pillow and placed it at her bedside as she prepared to end her life. In this way, she hoped to exact retribution on her husband from beyond the grave. But careful forensic analysis of the evidence had foiled her plot. Aaron Mintz was found not guilty in the death of his wife. If hiding the body is not an option, then hiding the crime is the next best choice. But a seamless veil of deception is difficult to weave. At a crime scene, investigators are always looking to challenge their own assumptions. A battery of forensic tests gives them the means to do it. Whether an alibi is grandiose or utterly simple, if it's based on a lie, it won't withstand close scrutiny. Time and again, killers who believe otherwise are proven